thank you all for coming tonight. As Beth mentioned, I'm curator of an exhibition which will open on August 3rd at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, which is where Winslow Homer executed this painting. It's one of the many wonderful works he made during his earliest years as a marine painter, aged 33 to 44, 1869 to 1880. And it's these years on which the show will focus. Over the next 35 minutes, I will cover a lot of material at a fast clip and then take your questions. My hope is that I can give you a bit of background on the exhibition, an overview of it, and then some reflection on what our research preparing for the show has taught us already about this much-loved American painter. And I am expecting Oliver Barker, the new director of the museum, tonight, but I don't see him. Oliver, are you here anywhere? Oliver may join us a little bit later. He is as excited as I am about this moment in the cultural life of Cape Ann. As you probably realize, the Cape Ann Museum is known most of all today for its superb collection of oil paintings by Fitzhenry Lane, the Gloucester-born maritime painter and key figure in American Luminism. But important as Lane is, the even bigger story of art on Cape Ann is that of a series of major American artists who found their way to Gloucester and its surrounding communities in the years after Lane's death in 1865, from Marsden Hartley to John Sloan to Edward Hopper, who met his wife in Gloucester, yet nevertheless preferred the Cape named after a fish to the one named after a queen, to Stuart Davis. But of all these great artists who followed in Lane's footsteps, none has more scholarly significance or popular appeal than Winslow Homer. So the story of what kind of a Winslow Homer exhibition the Cape Ann Museum might mount begins with this painting, originally titled Manchester Coast. Both in 2008 and again in 2016, as a longstanding board member at the museum, I raised the idea of a small Homer exhibition focused on his underappreciated Manchester works of the late 1860s. As a Manchester resident, I like the idea that before Homer got to Gloucester, he painted in Manchester. Presented here, right in the center of Cape Ann, despite popular opinion to the contrary. And Homer executed 3 major paintings which relate to Manchester, including the one I just showed you, and Lobster Cove, a painting of 1869, and then his best-known Manchester work, which depicts bathers on Singing Beach. And as the museum staff and I explored the material more deeply, we realized that we could put together a modest but fine exhibition built around these 3 paintings, using contextualizing material, of which we hoped we would find a lot at the museum, such as this illustration which Homer designed. And we hoped that we might borrow 1 or 2 drawings he made during his time in Manchester, such as this preparatory sketch for his painting, Rocky Coast and Gulls, and this privately owned portrait of his longtime friend John Murray Brown, who was a leader in the Boston publishing world and ran the firm Little Brown. So we agreed that if we could win the loan of just one of the 3 cornerstone works, we might have a show. And if we could get 2, we would have a show. And so I went to New York and made my case to the Metropolitan Museum, where an acquaintance, Sylvia Yunt, head of the American wing, quickly became a friend and a true patron saint to the project. And Sylvia said that the Met likely would lend their painting. And of course, I went to the MFA and made my case for this painting to a lifelong friend, Elliot Davis, then head of the Art of the Americas at the MFA, who was similarly very supportive. And then in pursuit of this painting, I went to the Cooper Hewitt in New York, and while it wasn't a love fest, I heard they were a little grudging at first, but I heard what sounded like the beginnings of a yes. And so with 2 and even possibly 3 of the 3 cornerstone loans in hand, we agreed to go forward with the exhibition. And throughout this process, I was speaking with everyone I could. And along the way, the project's patron saints continued to gather and sometimes offer surprising counsel. John Walsh, old friend, former head of the Getty Museum, and once upon a time here in Boston, for example, said that despite our initial success getting these loans, the show as we'd conceived it was just too narrow. He advised us to rethink the whole concept, to enlarge it beyond Manchester, and to take fuller advantage of Gloucester's part in the Homer story. John was confident, and I hope you will agree with him, that my friends and neighbors in Manchester would forgive my including in the exhibition Homer's work made outside of our town's perimeters. And so we followed John's advice and widened our scope to address the whole of Homer's marine works from the late 1860s through the most productive season of his life, the summer of 1880, in which he made this remarkable watercolor that we will be borrowing from a private collection in Virginia. We found that our premise was more powerful than we ever imagined, allowing us to create a far larger show than originally we'd planned, and even larger than we had anticipated as we were preparing our budget last summer. And that, by the way, is the gentlest of fundraising appeals. And I'm happy to answer questions later on the topic. Today, 52 private and public collections, from the Annisquam Historical Society to the Yale University Art Gallery, have agreed to join the Cape Ann Museum as lending partners to the project, which will appear solely at the Cape Ann Museum, opening August 3rd and closing December 1st. Ironically, despite all the great loans we were able to get, in the end, the Met turned us down on the loan of this painting, which it turns out is just too fragile to travel. But we will have a great exhibition in spite of its absence. So that brings us to the overview of the exhibition, which is in 8 parts, following Homer's journey from the late 1860s through the summer of 1880. Our story begins not on Cape Ann, but in the crowded resort of Long Branch, New Jersey, which inspired, so that's here. Hopefully people can see it, okay? Which inspired several Homer wood engravings and 4 important oil paintings, 2 of which are lost. In the course of our research, we visited the Arkell Museum in Canajoharie, New York, which has a full-time staff of 1, but an excellent collection of Homer's works, including this painting, which the museum ultimately agreed to lend to us. It was a part of Homer's most ambitious Long Branch picture, Low Tide, which he exhibited just once, 150 years ago, at an exhibition in New York. The reviews were withering, with one describing the painting as a watering place deformity. Homer removed Low Tide before the exhibition closed and dismembered it. This is one of two parts of the picture which survive. Once the Arkel approved its loan, we immediately set down the path with the owner of the other part, now located in Madrid. The Homer at the Beach exhibition will reunite, for only the second occasion in U.S. history, the two parts of this historic work. We've been able to glean the specifics of Homer's time in Long Branch with remarkable precision in the summers of both 1868 and 1869. In those same 2 summers, he also came to Manchester, where despite many long hours invested by the team at the Manchester Historical Museum, we've not been able to find documentary evidence of his stays. And that's perhaps because his likeliest accommodation was with Benjamin Thayer, a pioneering lithographer and theatrical entrepreneur who spent summers on Old Neck Road, when there were about 10 families who were summer residents, a very small number of summer residents then. As I mentioned, we sought to borrow 3 major Manchester paintings of Homer's, and in the end, for the Manchester section, we were able to borrow, among other things, 2 of the 3, plus the oil sketch for the 3rd, which is itself a wonderful work and illuminating of Homer's working process. The show's 3rd section will focus on Homer's first trip to Gloucester, where he developed an intriguing wood engraving and, among other works, this sparkling dune scene, which appears to be based on visits he made to Coffin's Beach in West Gloucester, which is sort of adjacent to Wingersheek Beach. The following summer, 1872, was one in which both his parents and his older brother moved from Massachusetts to Brooklyn Heights. So Winslow appears to have been lugging boxes up staircases that summer and missed out on his beach time. But the next year, 1873, he was back in Gloucester for a turning point in his career, which was the summer he took up watercolor, a medium that he initially tried with such hesitation that when he exhibited his first 10 watercolors, he gave none of them titles or prices. This is one of those first 10. And this is the only other one which can be identified with any certainty. It was the basis for one of his greatest wood engravings. And that same summer, Homer made a delightful watercolor, which was the basis for his famous painting of 3 years later, Breezing Up. A longtime curator at the National Gallery once told me that this is the single most popular work at the National Gallery of Art. I'm sorry to say they're not lending it. In the summer of 1874, Homer returned to the coast, but interestingly, not to Cape Ann. Homer went with a friend to the east end of Long Island, where he made this picture, now at the National Gallery, which is inspired by the French artist Boudin. We believe Homer made another almost identically sized painting on panel that summer, which for the first time we will allow viewers to see side by side with the National Gallery's picture. This is not universally accepted as Homer's work, although we think he made it at the same place and time, and look forward to letting the viewers determine their own informed opinions on the authenticity of the tent, the painting at the bottom. The summer of 1875 was another very important one in the life of Homer and his family, since it was his first trip to Maine, prompted by his younger brother's honeymooning in Prout's Neck, where 8 years later, Winslow would resettle from New York. Homer spent a month in York, close to the southern edge of the state, and made this major painting, which I will discuss further in a moment, and several wonderful drawings. Homer spent several summers of the late 1870s in upstate New York, but returned to the coast in 1880, traveling first to Greenwich, Connecticut, where he made a group of about a dozen watercolors in late June and early July 1880, focused primarily on the theme of the fashionable, sophisticated young woman. Homer posed several very similar models in and near a waterfront forest in Greenwich, Connecticut. Casting these models in evanescent moments, each alone in her thoughts, at one with the beauty of her setting. He arrived in Gloucester later that summer of 1880 for the single most productive season of his life, during which he made about 100 watercolors. They include this one, which has not been seen in public since the year Homer painted it, and was in the same family for 124 years until the painter Jamie Wyeth acquired it, and he's now lending it to this exhibition. And this remarkable sunset scene in which the beauty of the sky is matched by the ugliness of the fish, gaping at us like a gargoyle. A great example of Homer's sly sense of humor. We'll also include in the show this subtle study of emerging moonlight over Gloucester Harbor, and this depiction of a ship stranding, which occurred a stone's throw from where Homer was sleeping at the time, which anticipates later work to which we will allude in the show's epilogue, such as this unusually frieze-like watercolor inspired by a wreck Homer witnessed in England during his second and last European trip, begun a few months after his last extended Gloucester summer. So I've given you a brief overview of the chronological journey Homer made as a marine artist from 1869 and 1880, which is how the exhibition will be structured. But I haven't really addressed what new light we've been able to shed on such a widely studied painter. Today, most people think of Winslow Homer as the maker of monumental pictures, such as this one. But the central question which we are addressing long precedes Homer's late, great masterpieces. We're seeking to understand how this young man blossomed into the mature painter so beloved today, best known for his marine works. How did he move from pictures such as this to pictures such as this, the fog warning? We think that that question can be best answered by viewing his earliest marine works in context. Homer, born in Boston, raised in Cambridge and Belmont, and from age 23 living in New York, exhibited this, his first marine picture, in April of 1869, when he had just turned 33. Despite several ambitious paintings over the previous few years, he was making his living then not as a painter, but as a draftsman who developed designs for other artisans to convert into wood engravings. Both the wood engraver, seen here, and the draftsman worked on a fee basis for the publisher, either of a book or a periodical such as Harper's Weekly. The publishers owned the rights and all components of the process. While the prints made after Homer's designs were strikingly superior to those based on the drawings of other artists, that really didn't do Homer much good. Making these drawings for Appleton's Journal, Harper's Weekly, and other publishers put food on his table, but by the late 1860s, it had done as much as it could to advance both his economic position and his artistic talent. Homer had to do something to keep moving ahead. He did two things. First, like many other talented young American artists, he went to France. His 10 months there were revelatory and ended only when he ran out of money. Second, he went to the sea. One of the ironies of Homer's career is that before the late 1860s, when he first came to Cape Ann, this artist, now so closely associated with marine painting, had never made one. This plein air picture, among his first marine works, reflects both what he learned from French Barbizon artists and his ambition to do something truly new and different from the French, to create a distinctive form of modern American painting. The critics at the time just didn't understand what Homer was doing. Today, if we find fault in these works, it's due to their restraint. For example, in the disciplined, limited palette Homer applies here. But then things were different. French painting was new and unfamiliar enough that these works scandalized the critics. Homer had to read in the newspaper that his painting represents nothing on or under the earth but a dirty doormat. On the 150th anniversary of Homer's first marine works, our project will tell this story, how over a period of 11 years, in spite of such crushing criticism, a talented young man had the courage to give up his principal source of income, illustration, in the midst of a deep, bitter 6-year recession, to take up a new medium, watercolor, at which he quickly excelled, and which in fact contributed to his making some of his greatest illustrations, and to focus his considerable talents and energies on a single subject to which he would dedicate much of the remaining 30 years of his life: the sea. This was a period in which he not only grew into a mature artist, but during which he created works of extraordinary beauty. Given Homer's outstanding talents as a painter in watercolor, a medium in which he created not only true masterpieces of American art, but among the greatest such works ever made anywhere in the world. Surprisingly, despite all the attention which Homer has received over the years, this exhibition will be the first close examination of his earliest marine works. We intend that this project show clearly how, over these years, the painter developed into his mature style through a close examination of these works in context, using a wide variety of related material, including historic photographs, such as this stereograph of Lobster Cove on loan from the Manchester Historical Museum, and made just 100 feet from where Homer painted 2 years later. We also will draw on the Cape Ann Museum's own collection of related artifacts, such as ship models, and bring into comparison with the original Homer works other contextualizing materials which may surprise you. One example is women's clothing, such as this bathing costume from the 1870s. This is one of the earliest so-called water cure costumes, as they were described then. Earliest bathing suits still extant anywhere in the United States. And it would appear that Homer's model, right here, forgot her bathing suit on her last visit to a historical society in upstate New York. So you see them together. Here's the bathing suit. So exactly the same color trim, design, and date. Unbelievable. The exercise of placing these works of art in context has shed new light on Homer in a variety of ways, of which I'd like to offer 3 with examples. First, Homer had an uncanny ability to recognize the spirit of a place and select visual metaphors to capture that spirit. He had a knack for deftly developing compositions within which he could depict those metaphors with a compelling sense of their elusive truth. what do I mean by that? So here's an example. On his first trip to Maine, the ever-observant Homer noticed a new kind of double-ended vessel. Double-ended meaning the stern and the bow are identical. To this day, the boat, called a peapod, is unique to the Maine coast. And he posed an archetypal Maine fisherman with the vessel, a local man, George Henry Donnell, then 24 years old, whom we've been able to identify through the hard work and cross-disciplinary insights of the staff of the Old York Historical Society. Our ability to place Homer's works in context has depended heavily on partners such as the Manchester Historical Museum, Old York, the Boston Athenaeum, and Annisquam Historical Society, and many other organizations. We are profoundly grateful to each of them. In creating a painting of Donnell, his setting, and his distinctive vessel, Homer surely was aiming at executing works as evocative as any that Millet was painting as emblems of honest toil by French peasants in the fields of France. Homer's development of this powerful painting depended in part on his really getting to know the place, slightly upriver from York Harbor at Fisherman's Walk, where Homer's powers of observation captured not only the stones ground by the churning river, but also the worn bricks, which you see at the bottom here, that local house rights had discarded at its edge. Over his first month in Maine, Homer made abundant use of his model, whom he also placed in another picture, almost identical in dimensions to Winding Line, which he might have meant as its pendant. This work is signed, but far less finished in its execution. We see the same model and the same peapod at the same location as Winding Line, but from a vantage point allowing a view turned slightly to the west. The perspective allows the painter to include the mast of a tall sailboat, you see here, moored at the wharf in front of a historic drawbridge known as Sewell's Bridge, which was a source of local pride that year leading up to the centennial. Other examples of Homer's mastery of metaphors in his journey over the 11 years on which we focus include his frequent use of buoys on the shoreline of Gloucester, especially in 1873, the period of his first watercolors. Many of these wonderful first watercolors led, as I said, to superb illustrations. And his metaphor of boys at play also ties to themes in literature at the time, including books by his near exact contemporary, Mark Twain. A second way in which this project is shedding light on Homer and his work is by placing him more clearly in a social context. We've not unearthed letters between the painter and Mark Twain. Sorry about that. But we've learned a lot more about Homer's connections with other artists. Homer presented himself, even from his youth, as a dapper fellow. But from the beginning, there was something guarded about Homer's manner. He had an intensely private personality, which seemed to harden in later life, causing one writer to say that to visit him in his studio is literally bearding a lion in his den. For Mr. Homer's strength as an artist is only equaled by his roughness when he does not happen to be just in the humor of being approached. Our research has hinted at a different side of Homer. Despite his privacy, he had close friends, a lot of them. This is Homer in Paris in 1867 with Albert Kelsey, who signed the back of the photograph Damon and Pythias, figures from Greek legend who from ancient days have been admired as exemplars of true friendship. And in the spirit of friendship, a brief mention of two other exhibitions. First, Steve Rosenthal, who was already recognized tonight, is, as I hope you all realize, a remarkably gifted photographer, a Manchester resident and a longtime pillar of the Manchester Historical Museum. Steve will be doing his own exhibition at the Cape Ann Museum, parallel with the Homer at the Beach exhibition. This shot, taken at dawn on Singing Beach, is one of the wonderful photographs which Steve will include. Steve's exhibition will reflect his many years of visiting Cape Ann, beginning in the late 1940s, and ultimately settling here in 2001 with his wife, Ket. Here he has honed his powerful artistic gifts as he has walked in the footprints of those such as Homer who have come before him. Thank you, Steve. And second, we're timing the Homer at the Beach exhibition, opening August 3rd, to coincide with another Homer exhibition, which will open at the end of August at the Harvard Art Museums. That show will be called Eyewitness, and will focus principally on Harvard's own superb collection of Homer's work. But back to what the Cape Ann Museum exhibition will explain about Homer's social context. We will introduce viewers to a man who was not only Homer's friend, but his leading Gloucester patron, George Marsh. Marsh built this peculiar stick-style house just a year before Homer remodeled a stable in Prouts Neck to make his own home and studio, using an architect who'd been practicing in Boston the previous year. The breadth of Homer's artistic creations themselves alludes to the importance of his social context. They include a group of his rare ceramic works, most of which he developed as part of a New York social group called the Tile Club. The club had few rules. Membership was limited to 12. Meetings were held weekly on Wednesdays, and each member was given a nickname. Homer's was the Obtuse Bard. Perhaps the club's most important principle was that the members should enjoy one another's company with humor, generally aided by the liberal consumption of food and drink. The members worked at a common table to create a variety of 8-inch square decorative ceramic tiles, like this, but art making seems to have been secondary to camaraderie. Another window into Homer's social context comes through fuller recognition of his friendship with John Lafarge, who completed this ambitious painting in 1868. The very next year, Homer made this painting I showed you earlier, originally titled, as I said, Manchester Coast. Lafarge understood the hostile climate for innovative art well enough to not exhibit his painting for nearly a decade. Homer did exhibit his, and the critics hated it. One saying that the most noticeable point appears to be the dashing of the ocean spray above the rocks, but as indicated by Mr. Homer, it resembles the work of a boy who has dashed a spitball upon a newly papered wall. What the critics couldn't have understood was how much Homer had already learned from Lafarge, and how much he had learned also from Japanese prints, of which Lafarge was an early collector. Both pictures synthesize the lessons of Japanese prints, including a high horizon line, a contrast between the distant view and the exacting description of the foreground, and a slightly asymmetrical, vertigo-inducing composition. But perhaps the most surprising insight into Homer's social context came out of hotel registers from the crowded resort of Long Branch, where Homer developed this painting at the MFA. More than 20,000 guests registered at the hotels of Long Branch over the summers of 1868 and 1869. Among them, we found the names of just 2 artists. One, of course, was Homer, arriving in August 1868. The other artist also arrived in August 1868, exactly 1 day before Homer. Surprisingly, he was a significantly older artist, Martin Johnson Heade. He'd stayed at the United States Hotel, less than 2 minutes walk from Homer's hotel, the Metropolitan, and operated by the same hotelier. He seems to have begun this unusual painting while he was at Long Branch. The topography on the left of the picture matches Long Branch perfectly, as does the date. We know of no previous evidence linking the older Heade to Homer or Heade to Long Branch. However, as a newly admitted member of New York's Union League Club, Heade was certainly aware of the art market he served, including its patrons, critics, and fellow artists. It's difficult to believe that the arrival of his younger colleague, so closely timed to his own, was a coincidence. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean now separate these two parts of Homer's ambitious low-tide picture, one in Madrid and the other in upstate New York. It seems somehow right that on the same occasion on which this pair is reunited, we can also think about this pair, who together may have strolled the beach at Long Branch. But these two great figures in American art, so different in age, subject, and temperament, were nevertheless connected, if only in this one instance, reminds us that Homer lived in community rather than complete isolation. So we've discussed Homer as the master of metaphor and of his setting in a social context. The third way in which our research has shed light on his work reflects a fresh understanding of how Homer understood truth-telling. When I've selected the thing carefully, I paint it exactly as it appears, he's quoted to have said. That is, Homer used his remarkable powers of observation in a very specific way, considering nearly as deeply his framing out what he did not want to paint as his framing in what he did want to paint. A simple example is this picture, which he composed in such a way that he would exclude the derelict warehouse, right there, visible in the photograph on the right. And once Homer set his frame, he painted with exactitude not the cartographic reality, but the truthful appearance to him. The $10 word for Homer's approach is verisimilitude. We see Homer's idiosyncratic truth-telling in this ambitious watercolor based on sketches he made at 10 Pound Island, where he lived with the lighthouse keeper and his family during the summer of 1880. He deliberately framed out the vast expanse of harbor at his feet so that he could zero in on the action close to the Gloucester skyline. Another example of Homer's verisimilitude is the picture I showed you earlier of bathers on Singing Beach. In analyzing his process, we see that first, he executed an oil sketch of Eagle Head on the spot in the French manner of plein air painting. And it's interesting to note that just a few years earlier, Fitzhenry Lane made a drawing from the same spot, but with a characteristically punctilious commitment to a mapmaker's sense of truth, which led him to record the boxy house on the left, right here, whether, as I would, he regarded it as jarring or he didn't. We'll never know. But he was charting everything he saw with a scientific sense of accuracy. Even in his oil sketch, Homer framed out that house, which would have been just there, to the left of the edge of the picture. Martin Johnson Heade, by contrast, the year before Lane's drawing, displayed a commitment to poetry above all, leading him not only to frame out that house, but to frame in an island, which, as we know as Manchester residents, isn't quite there and isn't that large, and to produce a sunset in the southern sky whose rosy tones strike us as more lurid than true. He takes artistic license pretty far. And of course, Heat is an especially interesting counterpoint to Homer because of the connection between the two men, which I just cited. Homer's third way, different from both Lane and Heed, was evident in his final painting of Eaglehead, based faithfully on his oil sketch, but also with the insertion of these three figures, likely in his studio in New York, which helps explain the slightly awkward shadows. And interestingly, the tallest of the three figures stands just tall enough to block the sight of a second house built right after Homer made his oil sketch and right in the middle of his view. This is another photograph which we're borrowing from the Manchester Historical Museum. This is a handmade stereograph by a French-born Civil War veteran who's well documented in the files at the Manchester Historical. The more work we've done on Homer, the more we realize that despite his significance to our nation as a whole and to the world, he was deeply rooted in context, a context which can be understood only with patient, disciplined attention, grounded in place and in knowledge, both of the history of art and of cultural, economic, and social history. This mission, Art in Context, is what the Homer at the Beach project is all about. And so it's just right that the Cape Ann Museum, located in the heart of the town where Homer created most of his early marine works, should host this exhibition. Of the 51 Homers we plan to display, 49 will be borrowed from other collections, both private and public. But what the museum lacks in its depth of ownership of Homer works, it makes up for by its rich sense of context. Geographic context, yes, and many other elements of context, which afford a fresh perspective achieved through the careful formation of a mosaic of insights. We invite you to join us in Gloucester this summer to see Homer at the Beach. And in the meantime, on behalf of the museum and our lenders and our donors and all of our other partners, and on behalf of this gentleman, we thank you for coming and welcome your questions. Thank you. Any bold questions? Yes, John.
What was Homer's earliest artistic training? I don't think you touched on that.
Yeah. So his mother was a watercolorist. And one of the things I've wondered a lot about is how he could be so good so quickly at watercolor when he took it up in 1873. And one can't help but wonder if there were earlier ones, but there seems no evidence that he did any watercolors before 1873, despite surely seeing his mother do it. Watercolor was to some extent viewed as a kind of a lower quality medium. And it was only at that point that, that it was becoming acceptable for serious artists to work in watercolor. And so I think there weren't other ones. Part of what is so clear in developing this exhibition is that he was an illustrator long before he was really an artist. I think he thought of himself as an artist, but he was making his income as an illustrator, he was spending his time as an illustrator, and he was doing paintings only by exception, and it wasn't easy to sell them. And so his training was really in doing illustrations and doing them by the dozen. He was a prolific illustrator and was able to make impressive illustrations quickly and in a variety of circumstances, from Civil War camps to the Boston Common to scenes of parties in New York. And I think that training was the most important foundation for his art. Good question. Yes.
Phil, I recall a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, probably in the early 90s, seeing a painting down one of their huge hallways, and zeroing in on it immediately and saying, that looks like Singing Beach, and then approaching it and finding that, yes, indeed, it was Singing Beach. Was that a Homer painting, and it would have been, do they have other Manchester subject matter from Homer in their collection?
So the Met has a terrific collection of Homers, including a wonderful collection of Homer watercolors, which, because of their fragility, are in storage almost all the time. The same is true, by the way, at the MFA. They have among the best collections of watercolors. But both paper and pigment are fragile, and that's why they're properly in storage. In addition to its collection of Homer watercolors, the Met has very important tropical works and a number of other great Homer paintings, oil paintings. And one thing I didn't mention is that in 2020, late 2021 and early 2022, the Met is going to do a show on Homer in the tropics. And among the key works for that is their great oil painting, The Gulf Stream, which shows a man on a boat that's lost its mast, he's being circled by sharks. It's quite a painting. So they do have a great Homer collection. I cannot tell you I know of other depictions of Singing Beach beyond the one that I showed you tonight. There may be others by other artists, but I just don't know that myself. Yes?
Do we know anything about his social life or his married life, or was he?
So he, like Fitzhenry Lane, he never married, and he had no children. He was perceived from the roughly his 40s as being something of a recluse, and I would argue that that may not have been entirely fair. That he had these strong friendships, particularly with other artists, a number of them younger than him. He also was very close with his older brother's wife, who was originally from West Townsend, Massachusetts. And so I think he was a man with important relationships, and we've tried to bring those out in the exhibition. And I hope that when you see it, you will come out feeling like this was a very human artist. Despite his greatness, there was also a softness to him. Yes?
Did Homer have a benefactor, someone that backed him financially to some of his early paintings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So his most important direct and indirect benefactor was his older brother, Charles Homer, who was also an extraordinary person. He was a pioneering chemist who worked at a company which is called Valspar, now a part of Sherwin-Williams. And he was an industrial chemist who developed new stains and other stain-related products. He was a genius. And he was also very fond of his brother Winslow. And so secretly, at a key moment where Winslow was considering giving up his career in art, and basically all depending on what would happen with a particular painting, whether it would sell or not, Charles quietly, secretly bought that painting and shored up his little brother's confidence in his calling. So that's the sort of direct, an expression of the direct role as a benefactor. He also was catalytic in engaging the Valentine family, who owned Valspar, to be important patrons for him. And among the things that they did was not only buying work from him, but also hosting him at their farm in upstate New York, Houghton Farm. And I think those were really important aspects of Homer's circle of friends, that it was not only the financial support, but the sense of being in a community that valued him as a person, as an artist, and as a man. So that's a great question. Yeah. There were certainly people that regularly bought his work. There was a Boston-based collector, Edward Hooper, who was the greatest collector of his watercolors. But we don't have a lot of evidence of there being a personal relationship between Hooper and Homer. I think that the Valentines were earlier and more important patrons for him in a way that was more personal.
Thank you very much. And one personal question. Where did you come from in this?
I never intended to be the curator of this exhibition or the author of the 200-page book, which we'll be publishing this summer. My original role was as a champion from the sidelines, a longtime board member of the museum. And the project grew to the point where it appeared that my talents could be useful in ways that I did not originally intend.
But we're very grateful for.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, one more, yes?
Did he ever win over his critics in his lifetime?
He did. Yeah, and perhaps I should have included, did he win over his critics in his lifetime? So his taking up watercolor in 1873 was an important step, and there were a number of people that recognized that they had a genius on their hands when he did that. On the other hand, when he came back from this very important summer of 1880 with watercolors which were more abstract, shall we say, there were a lot of people that didn't get that, that thought that he had lost his mind on 10-Pound Island. And so it's a little bit 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I would say from roughly the middle of the period, the 11-year period that we're focused on, so the middle of the 1870s, from that point forward, people were recognizing that he was a really important artist. And by his death in 1910, he was widely appreciated as a major force in American art. Yeah. Thank you.